Have you ever wanted to make water bending effects but didn't want to mess with fluid simulation or any of that complicated stuff? Well, this is the tutorial for you because I'm going to show you how to make this kind of first-person water bending effect that has tracking and all of this, but it only uses modifiers and particles and things that are kind of lightweight on the computer and you don't have to click simulate every single time. So in this tutorial, we're going to go over how to track a shot. I'm actually going to be using a new program that you probably haven't seen before called Synthesize to do this. Once we do that, I'm going to show you how to import that track into Blender. We're going to talk about how to make this water thing with the correct materials, how to do a particle system, and how to do the splashes on the thing. So if that sounds good to you, let's begin. By the way, before we go in too deep into here, I just want to say I get kicked out of this hotel or motel in an hour or two. So there's a lot at stake. I really got to get this right the first time. Let's go for it. So, starting off, here is the footage that we are going to be working with. Feel free to film your own. If you want to be a patron to this channel, you are going to get the source footage. But just film yourself going to a body of water doing some hand stuff, okay? And the main thing I want you to notice about this shot, since we're going to track it, the camera's moving, is that the camera is it's moving, but it's not moving through space. It's not like I'm taking my phone camera and I'm walking around, right? I'm just kind of tilting it as if it was on a tripod. This is important because for our camera solve, we need to know that information, that it's basically a nodal pan, a tripod move. So just notice that the camera isn't like moving through space, I'm just tilting it. With that, let's begin with the tracking. So I'm going to be using Synthesize for this. Again, if you've never messed with Synthesize, don't worry about it. You can also do the tracking in Blender. This is just realistically what I use for tracking, so I wanted to show you the actual workflow. But feel free to skip this part if you don't care. So I'm going to open up a new project, and the way we do that in Synthesize is by immediately importing in the footage. So I'm looking for the name of it. There we go. And all of that is fine. And you can see, here we go. We have a vertical phone video, which is actually interesting because tracking it is pretty similar, but importing it into Blender is not. I made a video about that. But okay, so we have this thing. We want it to be a tripod, on a tripod, nodal pan. But I want to make sure that when we're tracking it, it's not going to be messing with the hand or anything like that, because I don't want trackers to be attached to this moving thing. So I'm going to go to the Roto Masking. This is just where you make a mask, and I'm just going to set up a simple mask, a rectangular one, kind of isolate this area, and I'm thinking, yeah, the hand is pretty much contained within this rectangle for the whole shot. So you can animate this so it's kind of following the hand, and then, you know, we can actually track some of this foliage down here, some of this dead winter, almost spring foliage. But I feel like most of the shot is still available, so that's fine. So just set up a mask. That's going to tell Synthesize don't track there. And then back in the summary panel, we'll just keep it simple. Are we zooming? No, we just have a set focal length. Are we on a tripod? Yes, this is the big deal. Corners, fine-tune, blah, blah, blah. Fine-tuning's not bad, so I'm saying it's on a tripod. After you track it, fine-tune it. Go for a second pass and make sure those trackers are dead on. And let's run the tracker cleanup, and I think that's all we need to do. Let's click Auto. So the reason I'm using Synthesize is because of this. It is extremely fast at what it does. So we already got a camera solve, so you can see these yellow dots are, 3D markers in our scene, and you can see our camera right here. This is our 3D animated camera, is doing the tilting motion. Before we export this, just a couple things we can try. Let's try cleaning up trackers, so getting rid of problematic trackers. So we can already see if we have a threshold of 30. I'm saying find trackers that have at least 30 pixels worth of error. There's one that qualifies, a high error tracker. So I'm going to fix that. You can see you got rid of one on the water, which makes sense. You wouldn't want something tracking a reflection. We're going to refine the tripod, and we already got a bit of a lower solve. And you could kind of keep doing this. But I'm fine with like 1.2 pixel error, which is actually normally want under a pixel, but if it's a nodal pan, we're a bit more lenient. Only other thing I want to do is I want to line up our solve. So I'm going to quad perspective. In this view, hit L. And I know this is probably a lot of new information, but that's just what it is. L is for lock, and what it's going to let us do is see from the camera view. And the thing I want to do here is you see we have this ground plane, which is tracked on. I want to orient this so it's kind of on our water surface. And unlike a normal track where we have a moving camera on a tripod, you kind of get to pick where that is because all the points are on this like sphere equidistant. So let's reorient the ground plane. So go to 3D, go to rotation. I want to rotate the whole scene. And when I say whole scene, I mean whole scene. And this should, yeah, it's going to let us rotate it. And you can see from this view, this is the one we care about, our ground plane is starting to match a bit more. So I'm just going to rotate it. I feel like it's a bit off kilter this way. So I'm going to rotate it a bit this way. This is not a exact science. I mean, it could be, but the way I'm doing it is not an exact science. We can also move and not just rotate. So I'm just going to shift this so that the midpoint is closer to the camera. And I'm thinking also I want to rotate it about the z-axis, so something like that. So this is literally what I was doing last night. I had this goal of, so you know, I'm doing my walk. I don't want to talk about it too much yet. I'll do a reveal video, but every once in a while I stop in a hotel and I want to mass record tutorials and videos. My goal for the last day or two is to record 6 videos. So yeah, yesterday I was blitzing through effects, and today I'm doing the explanation. So you can see, either way, we have a ground plane. It looks pretty tracked on. It's not going to be perfect. That's just the thing with a nodal pan, but it's workable. And the fact that we're doing stuff on a water surface makes it pretty forgiving because it's kind of hard to tell. Okay, so we have a ground plane. Probably a good idea to save. And again, if you are a patron, you can get the track alembic that we're going to export anyways, but I'm going to save it. This can also be done in Blender. I'm just doing the tracking quickly here. So we saved it, and now we need to take this tracking information, these dots, our camera movement, the orientation, bring it into Blender. To do this, I'm going to export. There are a bunch of ways you can do this. There's even a Blender script. I've had issues with this. I don't know if they've cleaned up their act, but every single time, a Alembic 1.5 has worked for me. So I'm just going to export it as an Alembic. So I'm going to call it water track for tutorial. That's going to export an Alembic with the default settings. Click OK, and we are good to go. And now we need the painful process of, you can't just like import the Alembic into Blender and it's all good. We got to do a bit of work. So now we have to do the painful process of that, which I feel like I'm exaggerating. It's a minute worth of work. So in Blender, I'm using 3.1 alpha. I feel like I should probably upgrade pretty soon. Is 3.1 like actually released and now 3.2 is an alpha or beta or something? I don't know. Either way, everything we do is compatible in 3.0, 3.1, whatever. So in Blender, delete everything. We are going to import in an Alembic, which is going to add the camera. So you can delete the camera. Import Alembic. Wherever you exported it, import it. So water track for tutorial. And you can see, so this is one thing about the synthesize import. The scale is way off, like everything's huge. But you can see we have our tracker markers, we have this camera moving up and down, and we have this weird background plane. But when we go to the camera view, you can see the motion is kind of there. You can almost imagine I'm like, you know, filming it and my hand's doing the thing. But there's a lot of things to correct for. Mainly, you can see we're in a 16:9 aspect ratio, whereas we want to be in a 9:16, which I actually made a video about. It's you might think the solution to this is literally just swapping the resolution, so 1080, 1920. It gets the right aspect ratio, but it's not the right size. So I made a video about this, and I'll explain it again. But the first thing is we need to swap the resolutions. I want to match the frame rate, so I think it was 30 frames per second. Make sure the thing starts on frame 1, so this is just the checklist of things to do. Make sure it starts on frame 1. To make sure that everything's working, I'm going to go into the camera and import in the movie clip, the footage we filmed. I filmed. You weren't there. As the background, so we can see that everything's tracking on correctly. So background images, I'm adding a movie clip. What movie clip do I want to add? The one that is correct, called water base footage. There we go. And make sure that's in the foreground so we can see it. So you can see it's like almost correct, but incorrect. Like you could see these trackers, which are very tiny, but all these trackers, they're not attached to the scene. So this is the issue, right? If this framing was bigger, so it took up this whole background plane, this would be fixed, right? So if I made the scale of the footage bigger, so it takes up the whole thing, you can now see the track is correct, but we're not occupying the full frame, so we need to fix that. It turns out the missing step here is you go to camera, you go to the sensor, and you make it vertical. This is only relevant for filming, for when you're filming vertically, which is almost never, but I found that this is part of the process for this, and that's what I made a tutorial about, this one button, but it is important. because when you rotate the resolution, you have to almost rotate the sensor as well for it to make sense. Either way, you can see our track is there properly. I'm going to take this background plane, this massive mesh, delete it. We don't need it. And you could delete the trackers. I'm going to keep them for now. But you can see our track is now imported. It's a bit shaky. Oh, wait. There's a reason it's a bit shaky, by the way. There's one thing we forgot to do. In the alembic settings, so you go to your camera, you go to the properties, you're going to see there's this transform modifier, which is basically this like alembic import or constraint. It's an alembic import constraint. Go to time and offset the frame by 1. That's the last thing, because it started at frame 0. We didn't want that. We wanted it to start at frame 1, and we need to offset it here so that the alembic knows to also shift it over. So now let's see what this looks like. There we go. That's a lot less shaky. So in general, your track is going to be as good as it was in Synthesize, right? Because we've now done the whole import process. And I guess this would be a good time to save. Water tutorial. And now, really all we have to do is kind of set up our scene, do the not fluid simulation, but the particle simulation, some procedural stuff, and that's kind of the deal. Only other thing I'm going to do is in the color management, I'm just going to set this to standard. That's just going to make it so that when we render things, it matches a bit better. So let's see. Let's see if we add a plane or, you know, a cube. It doesn't really matter. If we add something to the scene, you can see it's very, very far away. And it's like fine. Like we could just take the object and move it down the y-axis and do that whole thing. But I'd much rather center our coordinate system. So let's do that. I'm going to add an empty to the scene. The reason I'm going to do this is when you take your camera, which we can't really see, so I'm just going to make it visibly bigger. And you try to move it, you're going to see that you can't because it's attached by that alembic. But if we parent it to an object, we can then do stuff with it. So I'm going to take the camera, control-click the empty. I know you couldn't see that because of my face. Sorry, I have a big forehead. Take the camera, control-click the empty is what I did. Control-P, parent. So now this is a parent of the empty. And what this lets us do is when we move the empty, it also moves the camera. At this point, we can get rid of all the trackers. So I'm just selecting, I know you can't see, I'm selecting everything that isn't the camera and the empty, so all the trackers, and I'm deleting them. So it will just kind of look like this. What I want to do is I want to take this empty and shift it on the y-axis, which will not change anything from our camera view. But remember, what's actually happening here is we're moving the camera relative to this empty. So now you can see the coordinate system is centered here. If I wanted to rotate it, you can see anything we do, it's still going to be tracked on. I'm just changing kind of our initial setup. And we might also want to do some scaling here. So let's see. I'm going to add a cube. Yep, that still looks a bit small. So in the empty, we could scale to the 3D cursor, I believe. We can scale that down. Again, what this looks like is moving the camera closer to the midpoint, which will make it look like our cube's bigger, but whatever. Point is, I'm just setting up my scene for an easy time, okay? Other than that, I think we are ready to do the water simulation part. So I'm going to put this in the back, and let's begin the water simulation part. So we have a track. How do I plan to do this? Well, I want to plane on the ground or on the water. This is going to be kind of our collision detector. I want there to be splashes when things happen. That's going to be a huge part of selling this effect. So I want ripples on the existing water, and then we need something to spawn water and all that, but without fluid simulation. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to start with a plane. We could do this in wireframe so we can see what we're doing. Take it, scale it up. Again, on the empty, I'm just going to shift everything over so it's more contained in the water. That looks pretty good. To make our lives a bit easier, you want to take the plane and make it small enough and like to the side enough that it's not really intersecting with our hand, because otherwise we need to roto our hand, right? So I want to make sure the effect isn't like pasted on top of anything that it shouldn't be. So here we have our plane. That looks pretty good. And let's make a water thing coming out of it. So to do this, what I did is you could use a sphere. But I found a cube is better, so I'm gonna take a sphere and distort it and make it look watery. The reason I'm starting with a cube is our distortion is going to be done with the Displace Modifier. Spheres have this issue where in their geometry they have poles on the top, which I want to avoid. So with a cube, what we can do, you're like, oh, how does a cube solve the issue? It's a completely different thing. By the way, I gotta keep checking the time. We're good. If we had a subsurf with a couple levels of division, you can see it's technically a cuboid. It's not actually a sphere. But you could see it closely approximates a sphere. But it's not going to have any poles, right? If I look at its geometry, it's better. So subsurf, I applied it. You don't have to. And then add a displacement modifier. This displacement is what's going to give it the warpy thing. So I'm going to say don't just displace everywhere by a certain strength, but use a texture to make it random and procedural. For that texture, use a cloud thing. So we could call this displace. I'm just giving a name for the texture that's being fed in here. And you can see it makes this. To make it look more blobular, I'm going to increase the size of our texture or decrease it. I'm going to make this number bigger, which in effect will make it like less concentrated on the surface, so there's more low resolution detail here. Think of that however you like, and you can also mess with the depth to add like more of a more layers of more layers of detail if you want to. I would recommend keeping this low because the whole thing about water is that it looks very blobular and undetailed. But I have experimented between 2 and 3, and I think I like 3. Either way, we now have this, but it's not animating in any single way. There's people walking through the window. It's not animating in any way because we just took our mesh, added a displace modifier. I think the only way we can animate it is just by doing stuff in edit mode. Yeah. So we somehow want this to be procedurally shifting the texture or something. A great way to do this is for the coordinate system, I'm going to use object coordinates, and then for the object, I'm going to add a new empty. We can call this displace. What am I doing here? By the way, we should give our things names. I know you can't see it. I'm making our plane called water. I'm making our cube called blob. What this empty is going to let us do is when we go to our thing, our displace modifier, and we select this displace, which I spelled with 2 E's, whatever, let's keep it. What it's going to let us do is this texture is now centered or oriented about the empty. What that means is if you move the empty, it animates the thing. So this is now kind of dependent on it. Also, if you now go to the empty, go to its like settings, right, its location, which is effectively animating this noise, we're going to add a driver, hash frame divided by 30. Basically, I'm saying every frame move a 30th of a unit on the x-axis. You can see now this thing is animated because the thing's animated. Beautiful. So again, the empty's moving, the movement is moving the texture is what's causing the displacement. So now what we could do is do a tiny bit of a simple animation. So I'm going to look for when the hand comes up, roughly here. Before that, this should be underneath the surface. So I'm going to keyframe the location. And then as I raise my hand up to around here, I want this to come up to around there. And we can also mess with the scale of that. Boom. So let's see what this looks like. It's underneath the surface and then it comes up. Those of you that are astute are going to notice that, yes, the empty is making this animate, right? But as it comes up, you can almost see there's a second level of animation. And this is because, yes, the empty is driving the texture, but it's relative to where our object is. So if I move this, you could see, wow, now it's animating, which is actually not good here because now it looks like there's like a second layer of animation as it goes up. Which if you want that, that's great. If you don't, then it's not great. The way you fix this is you have the empty be a parent of this so that they move together. You'll see what I mean. So it's still moving around about the x-axis, so it's still being animated, but now the z is nullified because they move together. So let's see. There you go. Now, at this point, I didn't do this for the original, but I can see a reason to not parent it and make it look more like, wow, it's like rippling and coming up and doing a thing. I'm just not gonna, but you could. And also something I just thought of that I did not. I'm redoing to make sure everything's, I guess we got to reparent it. Okay. Also something I just thought of that I didn't do for the original is you can maybe actually add a wave thing to it. Again, I did not do this for the original, but you could see it adds a little bit of something. So we could add this waviness that is made less strong. And that almost looks more like turbulent or whatever. I'm not going to do this, but just so you know, you can add more modifiers to make it look watery. Another thing we can do, by the way, another thing with the Alembic import is it always cuts off short. So you just go to where the footage kind of runs out, and you make that your project out point. So it makes the project endpoint 0 and the out point too early. But another thing you can do to make this look less like a sphere that we just distorted and more like a thing with energy or whatever. And by the way, as the hand kind of goes away, what we can do is I'm going to keyframe the scale, and then as this hand goes away, it's going to scale to 0. So, whew. What was I saying? By the way, I have a pimple in my nose. That shit hurts. I don't know. I don't know why I keep getting them. It's always in the same nostril too. Another thing we can do, let's get back on track. Another thing we can do to make this look less rigid is in the graph editor, I'm going to add secondary motion. So it's not just like keyframed up and then it just kind of stays still and then it scales down. I want this to be more dynamic. So I want this to bob up and down in terms of the z-axis. So we can go to our object, we can go to its transforms, the Z location, hit N for the menu, and then you've probably seen this process before. You can do this for camera animation, whatever. We're going to add a noise modifier, literally to the Z position. So you can see we still have our animation, but now this curve has some secondary animation on it. And we want it to be more gradual. So I'm just going to increase the scale. This is going to make it happen slower, but now you can see it's bobbing up and down, and you can also use this slider to control the scale of that. That's probably too big. So I'm just playing around with some settings. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy it, and then for the X location, just paste it and offset it so it's not the exact same curve. And now this is also animating kind of back and forth, although it is kind of doing it too much, so I'm going to take the scale, the amplitude of this, make it smaller, copy, Y location, paste, offset. So what do we have so far? Now it's bobbing up and down and also kind of moving to the side and stuff like that. I think it just looks a bit more organic. Okay, so now we have our thing. This is our water blob. We need to make it look like water, because right now it's just going to be a gray blob. We need to make it look like water, and we also need to spawn water from it, and also we need the water to collide. A lot of things to do. I'm thinking one other thing I want to include before we move on, though, is I want the scale to, on average, be a bit smaller. So I'm going to make the scale smaller, keyframe it. It's still going to scale to 0, but now it's going to be a smaller thing. Beautiful. Okay, so let's, I just listed a lot of things to do. Let's make this thing look like water, because the material we're going to be using is going to be applicable later. So render view, just to see what's going on. I'm going to make this cycles before we do anything. This is all going to be a cycles render. It just looks better. What do we need to do? We need to make sure that we don't have this gray background so we can actually see the footage. So film transparent is going to let us do that. By the way, at this point in our camera, this footage you're seeing isn't actually there. It's just kind of a an overlay. But when we do have this overlay, I want it to be 100% opaque. And okay, let's make a water material. So for this, it's actually quite simple, but the setup is what's deceptive and what's actually kind of clever about this. So in the shading, I have my blob selected. It looks like a gray thing. I'm going to give it a material so that we can give it color, as you can see. Specifically, for a water material, the fastest way to do this is use a glass BSDF, right? Is there any other kind of glass? There's glossy. Take this glass BSDF, connect it to the surface. You're going to see it's starting to do this refraction thing. You can't really tell what's going on because it's kind of like this glass thing that's you can see light passing through it and it's reflecting stuff. However, it doesn't have anything in the environment to reflect. It's just kind of gray. So the idea that I had here is what if we take the footage, right, this thing that's being projected, and put it behind the blob. So it's actually kind of distorting what's behind it. Well, how do we do it? Well, the thing's already tracked. So what I was thinking is we can literally just take a sphere, and you're going to notice the sphere is tracked. We take that sphere, make it 10 times bigger. It's still tracked. But the main thing to notice is if you look at these faces, it almost looks like they're tracking with the background. And that should be more and more true the larger this is. And that's just a thing about a nodal pan. It doesn't need to be perfect since I'm going to project the footage anyway, so it almost doesn't matter. But it'd be nice to have this thing kind of be stuck onto the geometry in 3D. And ideally, you kind of model your scene, so it's not just a sphere that has the background, but you model this hill, and then the sky's further back, and the trees are further back, whatever. But just take a section of this, the section that's actually I only want the section that is behind the sphere, if you catch my meaning. Take that. I'm going to expand the selection on my laptop. I literally have to type the more command to do this. So take that, invert, delete. So I have the selection. So again, we have this footage in the background. Well, it's not footage yet. We just have this thing in the background. And the idea is we project footage. So let's see how we do that. So you can already see there's more refraction going on because there's a plane here and then not there and whatever. Make a new material. I'm going to call this proj because I never type in projection fully. So now you can see it's black and now it's refracting black, so it almost looks more watery. But what we want to do is paste the footage on there. So image texture, we got to reload it because there is no movie clip node in the shader editor. I don't know if there should be, but I think it would make my life easier. Import the footage again, have it be a lot of frames. This is just supposed to be the project out point, so 136 I believe. But select these settings. When we view this, you can now see this has the footage playing on it. Of course, it doesn't look correct because I'm just taking whatever UV unwrap the sphere had and just kind of pasting it on there. But you could see, you know, in theory, kind of working. And more importantly, if I go to part of this footage where we have the water blob, you could see it's refracting stuff and it's starting to look watery because there's actually stuff behind it, right? Point is, we need this to be the correct part of the footage. So go to the coordinate system of this, Control T if you have a node wrangler. The trick is use windowed coordinates. This is kind of the projection coordinate system. If I show you from away from this, you can't tell because it's adjusting to where the camera view is. But from the camera view, it's going to be correct. So you can see, now we have water that distorts. Now you're going to see there's still a bit of gray. Part of that is it's reflecting this plane, but also part of it is it's reflecting this environment, which we can't see, but it's just a gray thing. So another thing to do is add in an HDRI. So an environment texture, and you can see immediately I get rid of the HDRI. It's just this purple thing, right? You can see that's actually showing up in the water, so it does matter. So for the environment texture, I'm going to load an HDRI, go to HDRI Haven, download a free one. I just found one that kind of looked like my scene. And maybe I left it in the desktop, to be honest with you. I don't know where I saved it. There it is. So I just found one that was like kind of overcast and kind of looked like it fit my scene. So here's the footage, you know what it looks like, and here's the HDRI. I just felt like it kind of had the same vibe. Just find one that looks similar. Because this thing is this refracted, you're going to notice a bit that it looks off, but not too much. Okay, so now we have a water material and it distorts and beautiful. Let's have the next order of operations. Let's have this thing as it comes out of the water, which by the way should also have a footage projected on it so that, I mean, that it looks correct, but also so that the reflections are correct because right now it's kind of refracting this white thing. Let's apply a material to this plane, but also have ripples come out as this thing comes out of it. Again, without any fluid simulation. So I'm going to use the projection material, same thing as before, so you can automatically see this water thing is now refracting that. So you could, I mean, you know what's going on. I'm going to make this its own material, though. I'm going to call this project floor because we're actually going to do a second thing with this, and I'll show you what that is in a bit. But this is going to be used to create the ripples as well, this material. Before I get to that, let's generate the ripples. So there is no fluid simulation, but there is other kinds of simulation we're going to do. Namely, dynamic paint is the fastest and kind of the most realistic way to do this. What is dynamic paint? I'll show you. Take this plane, go to the physics, add a dynamic paint. It's going to be a canvas. The other thing, the thing that is affecting it, this thing is going to be a dynamic paint brush. So you can see in the modifier stack we have this displace and then the dynamic paint is being applied, which is important because I wanted to know what it looks like after the modifier. The dynamic paint brush, make sure you click add brush, is going to be using mesh volume. Don't worry about it. But for the plane, what we care about is that it's not painting, but it's creating waves on it. So you're going to see that when we do this, nothing really is going to happen. Even though it's trying to cache our dynamic paint, you can see this pink magenta stuff. Nothing's going to happen. This is because it's using vertex data, and there's only 4 vertices, so basically subdivide. If I subdivide it a couple times, let's see what happens. Whoa, it looks horrible, but you can see it tried to do something. Let's subdivide a couple more times. And immediately it's starting to look a bit better. You could think of your subdivision as your resolution for this. So dynamic paint, one of the functions is creating this wave thing. And you can see this is a great way to make ripples out of, something that isn't expensive like a fluid simulation. Of course, this looks horrible. Like it's almost like too slow and too high and it spreads too far. But we can fix that. So in this, we're mainly going to be just messing with, wonder if anti-aliasing makes it look any better. We're mainly going to be messing with the canvas, not the brush. So for the canvas, first of all, make it open borders. What this means is as the ripple reaches the edge, it's just going to pass through it instead of collide with it. So here's without open borders. We have a ripple, and it kind of collides and makes more ripples, as you can almost see. Open borders just means the ripple passes through it, at least in theory. Another thing to do is it's way too slow. So take the time scale, bring it up, I believe. Yeah, immediately that looks better, and I think it should also change I don't know if it changes the height of the wave, but it does that. To make this thing less intense, the dampening, make it stronger. This is going to make it so that it doesn't kind of reach as far out and isn't as intense. You want to play with this number until you get the look you want. You make it too big, like, I don't know, 0.4, and almost nothing's going to happen, as you see, right? It's just like a tiny circle. Maybe that's what you want, but I want a bit more going on. So something like that. And the most important thing is I don't want these waves that are propagating to kind of go past. I know we have the open borders, but we don't want it to go past there because it's going to introduce some discontinuities that are going to be hard to mess with. So, boom. Easy. Maybe I'll lower it a tiny bit more, get a tiny bit more wave out of this. Nice. So the question is, how do we make this wave kind of show up? Because when we go to rendered view, you're not going to see it. Why? Because even though we have this messed up geometry, which is good, after we do it, we're projecting footage onto it using windowed coordinates. So you can't see it unless you kind of look from the z-axis, or looking perpendicular to the z-axis. So we somehow need to take this windowed coordinates and say, project the footage, but wherever we have ripples, kind of make it distorted. Here's the trick that I don't think I discovered it, but I'm the first one who documented it, I think, when I made the matrix mirror tutorial. The key insight I had is if you use reflection coordinates, they kind of depend on where you're looking, and it's a reflection. Meaning that if I use this for this, so I'm projecting the footage, but now I'm using reflections, it makes this reflection-y looking thing. And you can see the ripples. So the key insight I had is we're going to use windowed coordinates. We can mix this windowed coordinates with reflection coordinates only where the waves are. How do we know where the waves are? Well, the waves are just these things going up and down on the z-axis. So why don't we just take the normal coordinates? So you can see the plane is all blue. It's all z facing up 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. Whenever we have waves, it messes with the normal coordinates. So we take this, vector math, I say give me the distance between that and 0, 0, 1. If you don't know, not divide, distance. If you don't know what this means, the way you want to interpret this is I'm saying take normal coordinates, this thing that is being distorted by the waves. Tell me the distance, in other words, where is it different from 0, 0, 1, just what the normal is supposed to be if it's an unaltered plane. In other words, it's going to give us white wherever there's ripples happening. That's the key insight I had. You take this, you say mix it with the coordinate system, so it's going to be windowed coordinates, except for where it's white, and then it's going to be reflection. And you can see this gives us pretty realistic reflections, and not only that, these are reflections that we can actually control. So you multiply it by 0, nothing happens, but the more you increase it, the more kind of displacement we have going on. So you can almost decide how intense you want this to be. So I'm pretty happy with this discovery, whatever you want to call it. But whatever. That's how we're going to have this thing coming out of the water, and it should work with motion blur and all this. The second thing is we now want this thing to kind of be leaking water. We're going to do that with particles. And as that happens, I want this surface to kind of have ripples coming out from the water droplets. That can also be done with dynamic paint. So this is all a self-working system. So for the blob, I'm now going to make a copy of it. The reason that I'm not just adding particles to the original is I want one to be just the blob and one to be just the particles. mainly for dynamic paint reasons, because I don't think dynamic paint lets you have a brush that is both particles and a mesh. So I'm going to have two separate ones. So I copied the blob. I know you can't see this. I'm going to call this one particles. And the only difference for this one is I'm going to go to a particle system. I'm going to add it. Probably should do solid view. So there are two of these now. So if I move it, you can see there's something underneath, right? This one's going to have a particle system, and we just got to make the particles kind of behave the way we want them to. So let's do that super quickly. I'm going to add in a sphere. Maybe making it low resolution is the move. I didn't think about this in my original, but we're going to have a lot of these. So make it lower res, put it off to the side, make it shade smooth. I know you can't see it. I'm just naming it droplet. What we're going to do is for each of these particles being generated here, we're going to paste a droplet. So that we can control the material and the size and whatever. So in render, go to object. So I'm saying what should the particles render as? I'm saying they should render as an object. Which one? The droplet. So you can see each of these now has a tiny sphere. Before I mess with the settings, we don't need particles before this thing comes out of the water, which is on frame 26 or so. So only start simulating on frame 26. And then stop simulating as this thing gets smaller. So I'd say 101, which will make it kind of look like this thing kind of disappears and it looks good. So we have the particle system. We now just got to make it look good. Couple things to do that. Scale randomness, increase that. So some droplets are big, some are small, and you can increase or decrease the overall droplet size. But another thing, by the way, the lifetime's too long. So you can see it passes through the plane and then it just keeps going. I don't think we need a lifetime beyond like 25. I just need it to intersect with the plane. Beautiful. And this is going to be good for our memory because it's going to be messing with less particles at once because they're going to die faster. You want to take this, take the number, make it way bigger. I'm not going to make it huge quite yet because we're not rendering. But the bigger this is, the more kind of it vibes with the thing because I want a lot of water leaking out of this. One thing you got to make sure you do is in the source, make sure you use modifier stack. Otherwise, it's not going to recognize that this thing's being displaced. And the displacement is what makes this thing dynamic. Another thing we could do to make this look good is in the velocity. How is the water shooting out of the thing? We can mess with it. So with the normal, maybe set that to 0 so it's kind of just dropping off of this instead of being launched off. So this is going to give it more of a streaming down kind of vibe. But we still want a bit of randomness, so I'm going to increase it. So some of them are going to go in slightly different directions. Doesn't look exactly the same. And you can also add a bit of tangent. It's going to shoot off tangentially. How's this any different from normal in terms of the theory? Not much. I'm just saying shoot it off in a different direction. And you can mess with this a lot more. You could add in force fields, like you could have a vortex here. I'm not going to mess with it too much, but you could, let's make it tinier. But you could do something crazy with that. Maybe that's the way to go. It looks more like, water bending, like you're doing something intentional. You know what? I'm going to add the vortex. This isn't a thing I normally do, but whatever. Off the fly tutorial making. So we have the vortex, particles. You can mess with more settings here. Maybe I don't want that much tangent if we're going to have the vortex. Something like that. I like the look of that. You can add turbulence. You can add whatever. Point is, once you are happy with that, we're going to need to make that cached so that we can use it with dynamic paint. Technically, you could do dynamic paint stuff without it, but it's much more predictable if you cache it. So I'm just going to mess with the particle simulations. Again, if you think this is bad, imagine doing a fluid simulation each time, which won't even look as good, and each time you have to wait a couple minutes, whatever. By the way, we could add a bit of noise. See what that looks like. Yeah, that looks good. So you can see the idea. Once you're happy with this, my point was, I'm just going to do some final settings. I'm going to make this thing a tiny bit smaller overall. Why? Because I'm going to be adding more particles. Now, for my original, I might have done like 100,000. I'm doing a tutorial here. So I'm also recording. So I'm not going to make it that high because my computer will die. But make it a bigger number. In cache, make sure your in and out points are set. You could give it a name, cache, water, and bake this. And particles really aren't that heavy, so shouldn't take that long. And you can see Now we have our particles. I think it looks pretty cool. And you could animate the vortex to do different things. As you know, don't worry about it. You can mess with it is the point. But what I care about is how do we make this thing dynamic paint respond to it? Well, if we go to our dynamic paint object, you go to the thing. Okay, it's a canvas. It has waves. I guess that doesn't matter. But you could see this. What am I trying to say? I feel like I'm all over the place. We have two blobs again. Which means, by the way, so we have two blobs. One of them does and one of them doesn't have particles. For the one that does have particles, by the way, this is important. In the settings, for render, disable show emitter, and also for viewport, disable show emitter. What this means is now the particles is one thing, and the water, and the blob is another. I know I'm all over the place. What I'm saying is I don't want two blobs rendered on top of each other. One of them is streaming particles. I want one of them to be the generator of the particles, but I don't see the blob itself, and the other one to just be the blob. So they're separated things. So here's the particles, and here's the blob. And the point of that was for the particles now, we go to the dynamic paint settings. So you can see it's still there. I think we want this above the dynamic paint. So first it displaces, then we have the particles, then it evaluates dynamic paint. For this dynamic paint, I wanted to use a particle system. So you're going to notice the difference here is our particles object has dynamic paint with particles. Our blob has one with mesh volume. So let's see if this works. So there's ripples as it comes out, and yes, now you could see there's ripples going on everywhere. And more so than ever, you know, more subdivisions means more detail, and since there's like a lot of particles going on, you might want that. And just like before where we could mess with how much is this distorting the water, we could do this again, but this time from the brush. So for the particles, I want to say how much is it affecting the waves? You could pick a factor, so maybe it's only 60% as strong. And you want to play with this. But the key insight here is this is still going to mess with the normal coordinates and let us do the whole material trick. So what do I want to do with this? Now that we have it set up, take your dynamic paint. We're not going to mess with it anymore. So make sure you're happy with the settings. And once you are, we're going to cache it because otherwise you're going to run into render issues. So I believe this should, bake from frame 1 to 136. You could even have it start on frame 20 like we did before. But just hit bake. Let's call it water DP, not to be confused with water. Don't go there. I know where you're going. Hit bake. And even this doesn't take nearly as long as a fluid simulation. So now we have, let's go to solid view. We have this. And it runs on my laptop as I'm recording. And it will actually look pretty good once we add materials and all this. Boom. So I guess one thing to consider is these water droplets, which are, again, just the sphere being pasted. They're just a white sphere. So maybe what we should do is for this one, so the droplet that's being instanced, we're going to apply the water material. So now each droplet is going to have its own thing. And by the way, I should mention, this might look a bit weird now. It honestly doesn't even look that bad. But one thing I should mention, the holy grail of this effect is particles, at least in 3.1. I'm sure even earlier. This didn't always used to be the case. They work with motion blur. So when we enable motion blur, this is a big deal because right now it just kind of looks like a sphere, a globular sphere is spawning more spheres. When you enable motion blur, this is what's going to make it look like water when we render it. So let me show you. I'm going to render one frame at like a low sample count. We could denoise it a bit, whatever. Yeah. So I'm going to render one frame. You're going to notice, once it does this, the particles are kind of more like streamed down, if you understand what I'm saying, because motion blur is being applied to them. So you can't really see each individual particle, and if you're worried about that, first of all, add more particles, like I said, or increase the amount of motion blur. The larger that number is, the more motion blur you have. And you can see now, like, it really looks like a stream of water. Like, I think it really sells it. And more so, it's refracting the thing in the background. Like, it all just kind of works together. And by the way, maybe I'll make a tutorial about this. Apparently, this motion blur thing can be pushed past 1. So this would be a bad look for this. But if you do this, this is going to give it a very creamy look, the water. As if, you know, you captured a long exposure of water in real life. That's what happens. but whatever. I'm going to add some motion blur, maybe a high amount. And I think the final thing I want to do here, other than compositing, is for my version, this was kind of a last-minute decision, is I wanted this water blob to kind of be glowing. Not the particles, but the blob. So for the blob, I'm going to make a new material. I'm going to call it glow, which is still going to have this glass thing. We could try coloring it. Yeah. I'm thinking literally making it glow would be better. So the way I did that is I mixed shader. So this is just making it more of a glowy water bending thing. You don't need to do it, but I'm going to mix it with an emission. So it's going to be, this is only for the blob, not the particles. So it's going to have both glassy properties and glowy properties. And for the glow, I want it to be this kind of bluish color. And I want it to be way stronger. Maybe that's too strong, but you can see it's also lighting up the particles and stuff. I mean, that is definitely too strong. But I don't want that being applied everywhere, only on the rim of the water. And the way I did that is with a Fresnel node, which kind of creates this gradient depending on the view thing. Don't worry about it. Click this, and when we send this through a color ramp, we can control. So I'm basically saying where should it glow, where should it not. This color ramp is going to let us kind of isolate the border of this, as you can kind of see. So making this mainly black, except for the rim, which is white. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, there we go. Now it's not looking as crazy. When you render this with motion blur and motion, whatever, it looks great. And really the only other thing I did for this shot is I keyframed how much this contributes. So like when the thing just comes out, it's not going to glow that much. In other words, you can have the strength be low, and as it comes out, you keyframe it being higher. I'm not going to do that. But the only other thing I want to do is just a tiny bit of compositing. So let's just render one frame, and then we'll do a bit of compositing. Speaking of water. How long have we been going? We're good. So again, the motion blur is a big part of this, and I would recommend playing with the glow a bit more to kind of see how much of a cast you want, whatever. And this would be a cool time to use caustics, but fuck that. I'm going to go to the compositing, and let's composite this. So this is the thing we rendered. You could see it's the simulation with the dynamic paint, and then also with our background thing that's being refracted, but it's missing the rest of the footage. It's just our render. So we're going to add in the movie clip, which should already be imported. We are going to we're going to slap one on top of the other. So this is done with an alpha overnode. I use Control-Alt-0. Shortcuts are shortcuts. Don't worry about it. But you can see this is like kind of the main thing you have to do with compositing. Slap one on top of the other. If you want to be fancy, maybe for the render, we could add a bit of a glare, which should mainly affect the glowing thing, because that's the brightest thing in the shot. Maybe make it a fog glow, make it bigger, and make it, I don't know, less intense. When it's -1, it will be as if it's not there at all. So you just kind of want to play with this a little. Just a subtle glow. And you can add more stuff to this, etc. But the only other thing, and now if you were to render this as just a thing, like it would work, because this compositing thing works for every single frame, and we track this, it's all working. But there is a issue or two that we still need to resolve. I don't know if it's going to be in this shot, but everything's working, except for there should be some particles down here, at least on later frames, because you can see these particles are passing through our dynamic paint, but they still kind of live for a bit longer, so you're going to see them every once in a while. So I just kind of need a way to not see that. So what I'm going to do is this. For the dynamic paint thing, I'm going to go to edit mode. I just want to select this edge, so I'm basically going to make a cover that we can't see past. On this edge, I'm going to extrude down on the z-axis. I'm going to take this whole thing that I've just made and separate it into its own object, so separate by selection. So now you can see we have our dynamic paint, and now we have this thing that is covering the particles. You can no longer see them. And also the blob, right? If we didn't have this, you could see the blob poking underneath. For this cover, I don't know if you can see this, I'm just going to call it cover. For the cover, we don't need the dynamic paint, right? It's just a mesh. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it its own special material. What material am I going to give it? Well, not this reflection windowed coordinate thing. but I'm going to give it a holdout. And if you don't know what a holdout is, so I'm just making a new material. So you can see this is a plane kind of hiding stuff. What a holdout does when we apply it is it's almost like transparency, but unlike a transparent BSDF, which would just make this plane kind of see-through, and then you can kind of see the particles poking out from beneath, a holdout is kind of like transparency, but it's saying wherever it shows, show nothing. Make it like alpha 0, if that makes sense. So unlike transparency, again, where it's transparent, you can see through it. I don't want that. I want to say wherever it is, just show nothing. So now when we render this, I'll render one more frame. It's going to apply our compositing. We should hopefully see no particles. And by the way, one extra thing that might help with your compositing that I just want to mention is this whole setup is great for refraction and all this, but we don't actually need to see this plane. I just wanted to do the refraction. So in the cycles visibility settings, for this, we can actually disable it from the camera. Notice it's gone, but it's still going to affect the reflections and the refractions here. That would only mess up if I got rid of glossy or transmission or something. Yeah. So now when we render this, it's going to be a bit more isolated, and that should make the glare a little less risky to use. And again, a big thing about mine that made mine look the way it did is I played around with the particles a lot until I got a look I want. I had many more particles, probably a bit more motion blur. But you can see how this is generally the effect. And it's going to look so good in motion. Let me see if so I'm going to save this, available on Patreon, of course. But let me see. I actually went through a couple iterations when I made this. So here was the base video. I then rendered a version just kind of testing the water thing, and it looked okay. But you could see this is where I found out the borders were an issue, and you could kind of tell where they are. So then I fixed that, and I made it glow, and it's starting to have a bit more character. And then, so I went through a bunch of iterations. Then I think I made the glow flicker, which I like the look of, but it was kind of too intense. So then I kind of messed around with it until I got a look that I wanted. And then I think I did even a bit more compositing in DaVinci. So it's kind of a process, but at no point did we use a fluid simulation. How long have we been going? Ooh, you've been treated to nearly an hour-long tutorial. Okay, so I'm going to do this spiel because I feel like I've earned it, and maybe it's useful to you. So thank you for watching this tutorial, and more so than ever, I want to talk to you about Patreon. Don't skip this part. It might actually be useful for you. So Patreon is a way to fund creators, people who make stuff. I make tutorials. And I have a Patreon account. There's a link in the description. It funds both this channel and the CG Matter channel. It is what lets me keep making tutorials as I'm out and about in hotels and shit. What you get, so it literally, it is the most direct way to help me, but to fund the stuff I do. But you get a bunch of stuff that you might actually find useful in return. So when you join Patreon, there are 3 main perks for my Patreon. 1, early access to tutorials. You could have seen this tutorial and a bunch of videos I upload a day or sometimes days, or in extreme cases a week early. And that's the lowest tier. So just for $1, you can see tutorials early. A second tier is the blend files. That's the next one up. You get access to project files, so like the original footage that I filmed with the hand, so you don't need to film your own. You also get the blend, caches, whatever, although caches are kind of a bit difficult to pack in. But you get the blend file, so you don't even need to make it yourself, or you could just watch this tutorial, learn from it, and then download the blend and then tweak with it. And that extends way past that, because I've had Patreon for like 3 years now, and I've been uploading blends and project files and assets for like 3 years now, and you get access to all of those at once. So it's a massive library. And 3, you get exclusive tutorials. I try to record one a month. Every once in a while, I do a tutorial series, an entire one in a month. You can get access to extra tutorials that are not available for free on YouTube. Most of my tutorials are available for free on YouTube. But the business model is make almost everything available for free. Hope that enough people join Patreon so I can keep doing it. And the patrons get the blend files, the early access, and exclusive tutorials. So I did one last month in February, and I cannot for the life of me remember what it was about. to be honest. So I guess go there to find out. But I try to upload at least once a month an extra tutorial. But that's just if you want to fund a bit more. Either way, Patreon, it exists. Currently, it fluctuates always when a new month begins, but I think currently there's somewhere between 710 and 720 active patrons. Sometimes that goes as high as 780. There's a lot of people that are currently on this. You can join them. There's a link in the description. If you appreciate what I do or you want to get some of those benefits, that is the way to do it. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something. It's been a while since I've done a shot from beginning to end. But maybe there's more of that coming soon. I don't know. Thank you for watching, and I'm done repeating that sentence.